All right, sanctions have been a really big topic as of late. And I had a question come up from one of our YouTube channel follower devotees, CAK or CAC. And his question was very specific to do with sanctions. Let me read it real quick. I'd like to know more about sanctions and trading platforms that do business in Iran. If we use the same trading platform, could we be in trouble? And then he finishes off, thank you for this great question and topic. And I definitely want to thank you as well for following, for watching, and for giving feedback and also bringing up some great topics to cover. I want to start out with a statement from President Trump on reasserting sanctions on Iran. And it started here on November 5th, 2018. All United States sanctions that were lifted under the disastrous Iran nuclear deal will be fully reimposed. Together with the unprecedented sanctions actions taken by the Trump administration, this will be the toughest sanctions regime ever imposed on Iran. Sanctions will target critical sectors of Iran's economy, such as its energy, shipping, shipbuilding, and financial sectors. Over 700 individuals, entities, vessels, and aircraft are going back into our sanctions list, including major Iranian banks, oil exporters, and shipping companies. The sanctions also target transactions with the Central Bank of Iran and designated Iranian financial institutions. Sales of food, agricultural commodities, medicine, and medical devices to Iran have long been and remain exempt from our sanctions. Reimposing sanctions will cut off revenues the regime uses to bankroll terrorist groups, foment global instability, fund nuclear and ballistic missile programs, and enrich its leaders. Now, economic and political sanctions of a country is obviously very serious business. There's obviously also a number of reasons why a country will face economic sanctions and embargoes. Iran has always been at the top of this list. Being a complete despot nation is obviously high on the list, with the government of these rogue nations providing financial and military hardware support of terrorist organizations, human rights abuses, development of weapons of mass destruction, and the proven use thereof of those weapons, trademark and patent infringement, drug trade, illegal weapons trade. The list can obviously go on and on and on for why there may be sanctions imposed on a specific country. Now, Iran is one of the countries, like I just said, that's been at the top of the list and has been on this list since 1979, really starting with Iran holding 52 U.S. diplomats hostage for more than a year. And at that time, so this would go back to maybe around like 1981 when they were finally released with the incoming of President Reagan. But the U.S. actually froze Iranian assets and also placed a trade embargo on Iran. Now, since 1979, there have been very few years that the sanctions have not been in place against the regime, and most recently they were partially or in totality lifted by the Obama administration, and now recently renewed by the Trump administration due to the fact that the Iranian government breached the agreement that they had on the nuclear programs, and it was really a poor agreement to begin with, and I think Trump has definitely asserted that over and over again. But it was really a case in point that it was a very bad agreement and really didn't hold the Iranian regime to any form of liability for breaching the agreement. And at the end of the day, we saw them continue to develop long-range nuclear missiles or long-range missiles, ballistic missiles, or missiles capable of carrying nuclear warhead. Plus, they continued with their weapons-grade nuclear development. So I don't want to get in depth into a conversation that ends up political. That's not the point. I definitely want to focus in on the fact that sanctions, what impact would there be? If you, as an individual, what type of liability would there be for an individual that is trading on a platform that may also still remain open to the Iranian regime or another regime that is facing sanctions? Hi, this is Jeff with the HODL Report. Join me on today's video as we explore financial sanctions and the potential impact on digital assets and digital asset exchanges, plus the individual liability thereof. If you enjoyed today's video, please give a thumbs up, leave some comments below, and if there's any topic or there's anything that you take from this video, definitely post that in the comments, whether it's pro, con. I think what's important is that we start a dialogue about this. If there's something in this conversation, if you believe that I've misspoke in some way, post it down below, and then we can bring it up in a future video. If you haven't done so already, subscribe to the channel. And one last note here before we get started, make sure that you check out the Ledger Nano S. If you haven't got one already, I think it's very important to have one. But right now, Ledger is actually running a promo discount. If you buy 2, you get a 20% discount. If you buy 3, you get a 30% discount. But make sure that you're buying your Ledger Nano S from an authorized dealer, whether that means you're buying it directly from Ledger on the Ledger website. If you go online, you can see that both Walmart and Best Buy are also offering the Ledger Nano S. So there's a link in my description below, and you can get it directly from there or go direct to the Ledger website. Now, we can for sure get into a drawn-out discussion and potential debate on this, on the various countries with current sanctions, embargoes. Obviously, we have countries like Iran, Syria, Venezuela, Cuba, and there's others out there who may be next on the list. But really, again, I want to get right to the point, which is to get into whether or not there is personal liability to an individual using a specific trading platform, a bank, an exchange, or a digital asset if a country like Iran engages in or does business with the company or that digital asset. Again, sorry. Now, before really talking about the potential liability to an individual or to an exchange, let's take a look at these specific countries. But let's focus in on the countries like Iran that are also developing a digital currency with the intent of circumventing the sanctions. Now, first, these digital assets are going to be 100% centralized and controlled by the state. Venezuela, I think, is a great example to use here. There's a video that I'd made discussing the Petro. I'll link it at the end of this video. You can go back and watch that one. But they purposely developed their digital asset, one, to attempt to circumvent the sanctions that were being placed against Venezuela, but also to overcome the extreme levels of inflation that have impacted this country's economy due to the economic policy and political policies that were already enacted by the same government. Doesn't make sense. Now, under the Petro, their goal there is to actually back the digital currency with natural resources like precious metals and oil, and they're setting the value of their digital currency based on these precious resources. But, I don't know about you, but I would not trust a government with horrible policies, horrible economic policies, human rights abuses. I don't know if I would trust them to back any digital currency or digital asset with anything and try to establish a value to that. To me, it would have a zero value. Plus their idea of attempting to use it to circumvent sanctions. But really, in both cases, I believe that, and whether it's Iran that's attempting to establish their digital currency, and they've made a statement on that, or Venezuela attempting to establish their currency, really in both they're facing glaring issues with the idea of establishing these digital assets or this digital currency. And again, number one, they are centralized, and like I just said, no one in their right mind would really want to or should accept them as payment. And so I think that that's very important. Now, going on, so there's 2 points beyond that. So the digital asset transaction leaves a footprint and is not hidden from view to the observing nation. So if the country is attempting to circumvent their sanctions, you would think that they would want to try to hide it from view of the world. But really, if they're going to utilize a digital asset for the purpose of circumventing these sanctions, again, there's going to be a footprint that the observing countries can then follow. Now, at the same time, the countries that are going to trade with the sanctioned nation are now exposing themselves as they will be breaking the sanctions. So if they're planning on breaking the sanctions anyways, why would they not simply continue to use fiat currency? Why would they attempt to use a digital asset or a digital currency if they don't necessarily have to? And why would they want to use that sanctioned nation's digital currency as a trade mechanism? It just doesn't make sense, because I believe those same countries are going to go back and look at the value of the Venezuelan Petro and say, look, I don't want any part of it. Now, it does get very interesting here at this point because the countries that are going to trade regardless and breach sanctions may face harsh financial penalties against their own financial interests if they do make that attempt to circumvent the sanctions. So most likely they're going to be less likely to want to engage in trade with the sanctioned nation. But if they do, using a bank, a global bank, is going to be more difficult, as many of the larger banks and the organizations like SWIFT are going to abide by the sanctions. So really here is where there might be that potential for the digital asset to be used for the transaction. But if this country is really intent on breaking the sanctions, they're going to find a way around the financial limitations of the banks and not being able to utilize SWIFT, for instance, and the presence of the many different digital assets out there to choose from may entice them to do that. Digital assets like a fiat currency should not and cannot, in this case, be held liable for the transaction, but the actors can be. So again, if the country is going to put themselves in harm's way and trade with a sanctioned nation, it shouldn't really matter whether it's a fiat currency or a digital asset. They're exposing their entire financial stability by offering up any kind of a trade. And so I think this would be a big negative. Now, obviously, there are some countries that do continue and will continue to circumvent sanctions if it's in their own interest. So we've seen this in the past with Russia and with China, and they've done that for years. And there's other countries as well who have attempted to circumvent the sanctions, and unfortunately you see that there's a continuation of trade relations with these other bigger entities, and it's definitely a struggle between the Western world, the US, and many of the Western European nations that do want the sanctions to then butt heads with countries like Russia or China that will attempt to circumvent. Now, when we look at the banks, or you look at like an organization like SWIFT, and just recently the Trump administration really singled out SWIFT and requested that SWIFT cease and desist from any cross-border transaction with the Iranian banks, meaning that SWIFT needs to abide by the sanctions that are being put in place. And obviously, that came with a threat. It wasn't a veiled threat. It was a very outright threat that if you don't abide by the sanctions, then there will be retribution against the SWIFT organization. But they immediately agreed to abide by the sanctions, which makes sense. And so this really does extend beyond just the Iranian banks. So there are other banks in the world, financial institutions that might do a significant amount of business with Iran. They might be owned by the Iranian regime or somehow backed by the Iranian regime, but their main corporate offices don't necessarily have to be in Iran, but the majority of their business is transacted back to and through the Iranian regime. So now let's take a look at how this could really impact the individual investor using a bank or a financial institution or a digital asset exchange or a digital asset, or a bank that might be using SWIFT or RippleNet for cross-border payments, and what would happen if the Iranian regime was utilizing those same platforms. Now, I do want to put out a note here in the middle of all of this that I'm not just, I'm not a financial advisor, and that statement I put on every video. I'm not a lawyer. And I'm not specifically an expert on international law, so I could be mistaken with my assessment here. I don't believe that I am, but if I am, and there's someone out there who is an expert in this field and they're listening and they know otherwise, please chime in on the comments, and that will definitely help further this discussion. Now, when doing business internationally, which I am very familiar with, it's important that you do your own due diligence, really, to make sure that what you're selling does not end up going to a sanctioned country. So if you're selling goods to Europe, for instance, or let's say the Middle East, I think is even a better example. If you sell to, let's say, a company in Dubai, there's many companies in Dubai that will import into Dubai and immediately take your product and send it over to Iran. So it's very important that you do your due diligence to make sure that the companies that you're dealing with in the Middle East or in Europe, that you get from them an idea of where the final resting place for that product is going to be. And you can only do so much. You can only do your due diligence to find out. If they tell you that it's going to be installed in a specific country, you have to take that at face value and track that product as much as you can. And so that's very important. Do your own due diligence. When it comes to working with a bank, sending money through SWIFT or RippleNet, or using an exchange like Binance to buy digital assets, the individual does not bear responsibility or liability if the bank or the exchange or the payment provider solution ends up breaking the sanctions that are placed on a given country. Now, it is the responsibility of the bank or the companies to abide by those sanctions. So it's also the responsibility of these banks and companies to make sure that their clients are not using their services to transfer money to countries or financial institutions that are specifically listed on a sanctions list. So the company or the bank, they do bear the liability and the responsibility for tracking all of this. Now, when Trump told SWIFT that he expected them to comply, and I just mentioned this, but there was an overt threat of punitive action to be taken against them by the U.S. If they made any attempt to circumvent the sanctions. A bank, Ripple, Binance, or any other is directly responsible to make sure that their product is also not used to circumvent those sanctions. And so that is a very important distinction. So to clarify this, are we as individuals, do we have guilt by association for what's happening? And I already said no, but let's clarify this a little more. So let's look, and let's say, for instance, JP Morgan is caught breaking the law in some way. Are we as individuals with bank accounts or trade accounts guilty of their transgression? And again, the answer is no. But there should be a caveat to this statement. I think this is a very important caveat. So unless we knowingly invest into an entity that is specifically doing business with the sanctioned country with the purpose of doing business in that sanctioned country, in that case, then we are guilty by association, because we're purposely using an exchange or a bank or a financial institution with the intent of that transaction going to the Iranian regime. So for instance, the Petro is a sanctioned digital asset. And if we go out of our way to buy off an exchange to buy that sanctioned digital asset, then you are obviously in breach and can then be held liable for breach of those sanctions, because that Petro dollar digital asset, digital currency, whatever you want to call it, is on the sanctioned list. Now, what holds true for our example of JP Morgan or the Trump administration requirement of SWIFT and the responsibilities of Ripple will also hold true for an international digital asset exchange like Binance. Now, Binance has a clear choice to make, and I believe they made it, but they really have to decide as to whether or not they will allow or block the sanctioned countries or the sanctioned financial entities from using their exchange platform. Now, as of 2 days ago, it was actually reported by CoinDesk that Binance did request and issued a warning that all Iranians with accounts on Binance withdraw their digital assets from the Binance exchange. So Binance is advising its remaining users in Iran to withdraw their money, as the crypto exchange is going to comply with the U.S. sanctions. Now, a statement from this article, let me read this real quick. If you have an account with Binance, and this is them quoting Binance, if you have an account with Binance and fall into that sanctions category, please withdraw your assets from Binance as soon as possible. Reads an email received in recent days by Iranian users, according to several local sources. Seper Mohammadi, chairman of the board of the Blockchain Association of Iran, said emails like this have been trickling in for months, but their numbers recently increased following renewed U.S. sanctions, which activated on November 5th. So so what we're seeing is that Binance is 100% doing their due diligence to comply with the sanctions. Now, they can take it a step further because they are in control of who trades on their digital, on their platform, on their exchange, who buys on their exchange, which countries can buy on their exchange, so they take it a step further. At first, the Malta-based Binance, which declined to comment for the article that we're reading from right now, was mainly shuttering accounts of users who provided Iranian passports as part of their KYC process, Know Your Customer process, according to sources in Iran. But this week, it also began warning accounts connected to Iranian IP addresses to get their crypto out, several Iranian traders said. Okay, so let's say that Binance decided not to block Iranians from using the Binance exchange. Obviously, we see that they did. They made the right decision. But let's say they didn't. They would undoubtedly face harsh financial punitive penalties. In such a hypothetical situation, the individual user, if you were still on Binance, you would not necessarily be liable, or you would not be liable for that transgression and would not in any way be guilty by association until, and this is where the however starts, that exchange themselves ended up on the sanctions list. In this case, all individuals utilizing that exchange would be guilty by association and knowingly using an exchange on the sanctions list. So if Binance said to the U.S. sanctions, look, we're big enough, we don't care, we're going to circumvent, we're not going to abide by the sanctions, and we think that our business in Iran is too important to lose, that we're willing to risk everything. In that case, now there are punitive damages and other types of harsh penalties that would be placed against them by the U.S. and by others that are establishing these sanctions. So once that happens, and once Binance would end up on a sanctions list. I'm not saying that they are. I'm using this as an example. Again, if you continue trading with that platform, you would then have the liability for working with a sanctioned entity, or a entity that is facing sanctions. Not as so. Let's try to clarify that a little bit. So anyhow, now if the exchange is then found in breach of those sanctions, let's clarify this. 100%, you would want all of your holdings off that exchange. So this is really, I think, it's so important, because you can't. There's many different exchanges out there. Binance is large. There's way too much at stake for them to not abide by the sanctions. It's kind of like SWIFT saying we're not going to abide by the sanctions. We know that wouldn't happen. Binance is has a large international presence. They're not going to jeopardize their presence and their standing in the world at this point. They have way too much to risk, way too much at stake. There are smaller exchanges out there that might not have the exposure right now, but they will be held liable if they attempt to breach the sanctions. Now, regardless, this is a reason why you want to make sure that your holdings are not on an exchange. So if you're on one of these smaller exchanges and they do breach and now they face sanctions and you're not paying attention, now all of a sudden your money or your digital assets are held up on their exchange. You don't want to put yourself in that position, even if you're not going to face the liability of it, because you can still pull your money or your digital assets off of that exchange. But why even put yourself in jeopardy? And this is another great reason to have the Ledger Nano S. Now, Swift, RippleNet, and any others are really going to be held by the exact same standard and must abide by the sanctions that are required. Now, I mentioned in the beginning of the video that we would look at I mentioned the digital asset on its own. So I want to just look at this a little bit more in detail. So let's look at XRP, I think, as a primary and important example. So can XRP be found in some way to be complicit of a breach of sanctions if Iran, for instance, is to purchase a significant amount of XRP via an OTC trade, an over-the-counter trade? So can that happen? Can the digital asset in some way be complicit in, or others that are holding that same digital asset be complicit in, or can there be sanctions placed on that specific digital asset? And I would have to say, in my opinion, no. That XRP cannot face any kind of punitive sanctions for that digital asset, from the fact that you can't hold the US dollar liable for what Iran does with it either, or any other sanctioned country for that matter. Again, in this case, the digital asset is going to be on the same playing field with a fiat currency. Now, if it was the country's digital asset that we're talking about, so you're sanctioning, and there would be good reasoning and rationale for sanctioning the Iranian digital currency or the Venezuelan Petro, that's different. With XRP, I don't believe that there's any liability whatsoever. Now, the party on the other side of the trade would 100% have liability for the transaction. Not the digital asset, not the fiat currency, but the person on the other end, whether it's a bank or an individual or a financial institution or whatever it might be. If they are moving a large transaction or medium-sized, small, it doesn't matter, but they're moving, whether, again, it's fiat currency, XRP, Bitcoin, Litecoin, doesn't matter. If they're moving that transaction to the Iranian regime in breach of the sanction, the digital asset, the fiat currency, will not be liable, but that other individual will be. Now, one final thing to consider would be the liability to a company, and I'm trying to think all the way through this, so if you guys have some feedback on this, it would be important really to dig a little bit deeper. It's really a topic of its own that we can dig into. but would a company, so let's say Iran decides to develop their digital asset using a protocol. Let's say they want to build it on Ethereum. They want to utilize the XRP ledger. They want to utilize Stellar. So would the company that does have control over the distribution of their software protocol, if they have some form of control over their ledger to allow for a company to then develop and build on their platform, can that company be held liable if that transaction occurs during the time that the sanctions were active? Now, obviously, if it's an open source software and it's decentralized to the point where there's no centralized control over the software, could the developers or creators of that software be held accountable? I would say no, unless there's someone that's purposely helping the Iranian regime in developing the software, or is involved in sending them the software. Then again, it comes down to that individual. However, if you have a central company that is responsible for their software, for their platform, for their protocol, and the acceptance thereof, to allow, let's say, the Iranian regime or the Venezuelan regime to build their digital asset on the protocol or on the ledger of this company, then there would be some liability. Now, on the other side of it, if the company, if let's say Venezuela or Iran was to utilize Stellar, or let's say they were to utilize the XRP ledger, but they did it before sanctions, and now sanctions were imposed, would that company still maintain the same level of liability? And I would say no, because it would be, again, like an IBM or Microsoft or Oracle or one of the many other software-driven companies and hardware computer-driven companies that had provided support or had sold product, sold software to the Iranian regime before sanctions were imposed. I don't believe that you can now hold them liable for what happened when sanctions weren't there. So that could be really interesting to dig a little bit more. It's a completely separate topic. So that's really it. And I think this was important to look at. I hope that there's some great feedback on this. If you enjoyed today's video, please give a thumbs up, leave some comments. If you have any ideas for future topics that I can cover, I definitely like looking at them, and I'll dig into them and try to get them out as soon as I can. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. If you haven't got your Ledger Nano S yet, there's a link in the description below. You can definitely get it from there, or you can go directly to the Ledger website, or you can go to Walmart or Best Buy. Make sure, again, it's an authorized dealer. Before I sign off, just one note. I'm not a financial advisor, not giving any formal financial advice, but if I am to give you any advice, then let it be this. Do your own research. Invest only what you can afford. Invest only what you can afford to lose, and don't buy or sell based on the FUD or FOMO that's spread online. With that, I definitely look forward to seeing you on my next